There is a moment in history that repeats itself with unsettling precision. Not a battle, not a revolution, not a dramatic collapse caught on the front page of newspapers, but a quieter moment. When confidence begins to thin, when certainty turns into habit, and habit replaces understanding. That moment is always missed in real time, and by the time it becomes obvious, the outcome is already sealed. Every global reserve currency in history has followed the same path. Not most of them, not many of them, every single one. Different nations, different centuries, different cultures, the same underlying structure, the same sequence, the same ending. The Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound. Each believed their system was permanent. Each believed their power was structural. Each believed history would bend around them, and each was wrong. Today, the United States dollar occupies the same position those currencies once held. The center of global trade, the foundation of international finance, the unit through which energy, food, debt, and power itself are priced. This is not a prediction. This is not ideology. This is not a political argument. It is pattern recognition. And once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Because the most dangerous assumption any society can make is that it is exempt from the laws that governed every society before it. To understand where the dollar is going, you must first understand what a reserve currency actually is, and why it always carries the seeds of its own destruction. A reserve currency is not simply a strong currency. It is not about patriotism or trust or moral superiority. It is about utility and necessity. A reserve currency is the currency that other nations must hold to function. It is the currency used to settle international trade, the currency used to price global commodities, the currency central banks accumulate to stabilize their own financial systems, the currency through which debts are issued, paid, and enforced. When oil is priced in your currency, every nation needs your money. When trade contracts are written in your currency, every corporation needs your money. When debt is denominated in your currency, every borrower depends on your monetary policy. This creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. It allows one nation to consume more than it produces, to borrow more than it saves, to run deficits that would bankrupt any other country. Not because it is smarter, not because it is more virtuous, but because the world has no alternative. Yet, reserve currency status is not a reward. It is a burden disguised as power. And history shows that no nation has ever carried that burden indefinitely. Every reserve currency begins the same way, with dominance, not financial dominance, but physical dominance. The first stage is always control over trade routes. Not influence, not diplomacy, control. Portugal did not become the world's first reserve currency because it was wealthy. It became wealthy because it mastered something no one else had: open ocean navigation. In the 15th century, most European trade was constrained by land routes, controlled by empires and intermediaries. Portugal broke that system by going around it. When Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they didn't just discover a route to Asia, they dismantled a monopoly. But discovery alone was not enough. Portugal militarized its advantage. Its ships were armed, its ports were fortified, its choke points were defended with cannons. From Goa to Malacca, from Mozambique to Macau, Portuguese strongholds controlled the flow of goods. If you wanted spices, silk, or porcelain, you went through Portugal, or you didn't trade at all. The currency followed the cannons. Merchants needed Portuguese money not because it was stable, but because it was necessary. Trade demanded it. The Dutch followed the same model a century later, but refined it. The Dutch East India Company was not merely a corporation. It was a sovereign entity with the legal right to wage war, negotiate treaties, and maintain armies. Amsterdam did not become a financial center because of ideology. It became one because Dutch ships dominated the seas. Britain perfected the formula. By the 19th century, the Royal Navy controlled every critical maritime choke point on Earth. Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, Singapore, the Strait of Malacca. Global trade did not move without British approval. The pound sterling became the world's reserve currency not because it was trusted, but because it was unavoidable. And after World War II, the United States inherited this role. Not by accident, not by charity, but because it controlled the post-war order. The U.S. Navy became the guarantor of global shipping lanes. American military bases encircled the planet. Energy flows, trade corridors, financial infrastructure, all stabilized under American protection. This was stage one. Once control is established, stage two follows naturally. Massive trade surpluses. When a nation controls trade routes, it captures value at scale. It exports high-value goods and imports raw materials. It sets terms. It captures margins. Wealth accumulates rapidly. Portugal experienced this in the 1500s. The Dutch in the 1600s. Britain during the Industrial Revolution. The United States after World War II. From 1945 to the early 1970s, the U.S. ran enormous trade surpluses. American factories supplied the world. American technology rebuilt continents. Dollars flowed outward, but real goods flowed inward in return. Gold reserves surged. Industrial capacity expanded. The middle class grew. This is the golden age of a reserve currency, and it is always temporary. Because success changes behavior. At some point, producing becomes harder than consuming. Investing becomes safer than building. Finance becomes more profitable than industry. This transition is subtle and almost always celebrated while it is happening. The moment when reserve currency status is formalized marks the peak. For the United States, that moment came in 1944 at Bretton Woods. The dollar was officially crowned the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would peg to it. The dollar itself would be tied to gold. This system institutionalized American dominance, and it guaranteed its erosion. Because once the world needs your currency more than your goods, the incentive structure flips. Why manufacture when you can import? Why save when you can borrow cheaply? Why restrain spending when deficits don't immediately punish you? This is where the Triffin dilemma emerges, the unavoidable contradiction at the heart of every reserve currency system. To supply the world with liquidity, the reserve currency nation must run deficits. But running deficits undermines the currency's value. There is no solution, only delay. And delay is what history records as stage 4. Permanent deficits, living beyond means, consuming accumulated wealth instead of creating new wealth. The United States crossed this threshold in the early 1970s. The trade balance flipped. Manufacturing declined. Consumption surged. The dollar's role masked the problem. Deficits no longer felt dangerous. Debt no longer felt restrictive. Money no longer felt scarce. And that illusion carried the system forward until it reached stage 5, currency debasement. Not through clipped coins or reduced silver content, but through expansion of supply. When debt grows faster than productivity, when deficits become structural, when political systems refuse austerity, there is only one lever left. Print. Portugal did it. The Dutch did it. Britain did it. Every reserve currency does. The United States is doing it now. This is not moral failure. It is structural inevitability. And it always leads to the same outcome. Loss of confidence. That loss does not happen overnight. It begins quietly. Central banks diversify. Trade agreements shift. Alternatives are explored. Stage 6 does not announce itself, it whispers, and by the time Stage 7 arrives, the replacement has already won. History does not repeat because humans are foolish. It repeats because systems reward the same behaviors under the same conditions. The dollar is not evil. It is not weak. It is not collapsing tomorrow. It is simply following the oldest monetary cycle humanity has ever recorded. And this is only the beginning. Stage 5 is the most misunderstood phase in the life cycle of a reserve currency. Because it does not feel like decline, it feels like management. By the time a system reaches this stage, the foundation has already shifted. Trade deficits are no longer temporary. They are structural. Debt is no longer a tool. It is a requirement. Growth is no longer organic. It is stimulated, and yet, to the average citizen, life still appears functional. Stores are stocked, markets operate, technology advances. Political debates dominate attention. The system feels complex but intact. This is precisely why Stage 5 is so dangerous. It is the phase where reality and perception diverge. Historically, this stage is defined by three simultaneous forces. First, the financial sector grows larger than the productive economy. Second, monetary expansion replaces real growth. Third, political systems become incapable of enforcing restraint. Every reserve currency has passed through this exact configuration. In the Dutch Republic, finance eclipsed shipbuilding and manufacturing. In Britain, banking and empire administration overtook industrial production. In each case, capital flowed increasingly into paper claims rather than physical output. The United States entered this phase gradually, then decisively. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. This was not a conspiracy or a trick. It was an admission. The U.S. did not have enough gold to cover the dollars it had issued. From that moment on, the dollar became a purely fiat currency, backed not by metal, but by confidence, military power, and institutional trust. For decades, this worked. Global demand for dollars remained strong. Oil continued to be priced in dollars. International debt remained dollar-denominated. U.S. Treasury bonds were treated as the safest asset on earth. This allowed the United States to do something no other nation in history had ever done at such scale. It allowed the U.S. to run permanent deficits without immediate consequence. From the 1980s onward, the country consumed more than it produced every single year. Manufacturing was outsourced, supply chains globalized, financialization accelerated. This shift was not accidental. Producing goods is capital-intensive, politically complex, and slow. Financial services are scalable, mobile, and immediately profitable. Wall Street replaced factories as the engine of growth. This transition was framed as modernization. In reality, it was dependency. Dependency on foreign production, dependency on cheap imports, dependency on the dollar's reserve status to absorb imbalances. As long as the world needed dollars, the system held. But Stage 5 always introduces stress fractures. The first fracture is inequality. When money creation accelerates, it does not distribute evenly. Newly created money enters the system through financial institutions, asset markets, and government spending. Those closest to the source benefit first. Asset prices rise faster than wages. Wealth concentrates. The cost of living increases quietly. This pattern is observable in every late-stage reserve currency system. In Britain, it appeared in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the U.S., it accelerated after 2008. The financial crisis was not an anomaly. It was a revelation. The system could not function without intervention. Debt levels were too high. Leverage was too extreme. The market could not correct without destroying itself. So intervention became policy. Interest rates were pushed to zero. Quantitative easing became normal. Balance sheets exploded. These measures were described as temporary. They never were. Once a system becomes dependent on liquidity injections, removing them becomes impossible without triggering collapse. This is the core paradox of Stage 5. The tools used to stabilize the system slowly undermine it. Inflation, in this context, is not merely rising prices. It is the gradual erosion of purchasing power relative to assets and obligations. It is the silent tax that allows governments to service debt without explicit default. Historically, this has been the preferred solution. Spain debased its coinage. Britain inflated during and after major wars. The US expanded its money supply dramatically after every crisis. None of this is unprecedented. What is unprecedented is the scale. Never before has a reserve currency been issued in such volume, so rapidly, with such global exposure. This brings us to the second fracture of Stage 5. Loss of discipline. When deficits carry no immediate penalty, political systems lose incentive to restrain spending. Every constituency demands protection. Every crisis justifies expansion. Every problem becomes financial. Debt becomes abstract. The consequences are deferred. But deferred consequences accumulate. By the time restraint becomes unavoidable, the scale of adjustment required is politically impossible. This is why Stage 5 is characterized by polarization. Not because people suddenly become irrational, but because the system no longer allows painless solutions. Every option involves loss. Raising taxes risks stagnation. Cutting spending risks unrest. Raising rates risks financial collapse. Printing risks inflation. So decisions are postponed, and postponement deepens fragility. The third fracture is external. As deficits grow and monetary expansion accelerates, foreign holders of the reserve currency begin to adjust. Not dramatically, not publicly, quietly. Central banks diversify reserves. Trade agreements bypass the dominant currency. Bilateral settlements increase. This is not rebellion. It is risk management. No reserve currency has ever been abandoned suddenly. It is always replaced gradually until the tipping point arrives. By the time the public notices, the shift is already advanced. This is Stage 6. Stage 6 is defined by declining trust, not collapsing value. The currency still functions. Markets still operate. But confidence becomes conditional. Borrowing costs rise. Exchange rates fluctuate. Alternatives gain traction. For the US dollar, this process has already begun. Not in headlines, in data. The dollar's share of global reserves has been declining for years. Trade conducted outside the dollar system is increasing. Sanctions have accelerated the search for alternatives. Again, this is not moral judgment. It is systemic response. Every nation that has depended on a reserve currency has eventually sought insulation from its instability. This is rational behavior. The final stage, Stage 7, is not collapse in the cinematic sense. It is transition. The old system does not disappear overnight. It fades. It becomes one option among many rather than the default. Living standards adjust. Geopolitical leverage weakens. Domestic tensions increase. The country does not vanish, but its position changes permanently. This is what happened to every reserve currency issuer before. Portugal did not disappear. The Netherlands did not vanish. Britain did not cease to exist. They adjusted, after resistance, after denial, after strain. The United States will be no different. The question is not whether the dollar will end tomorrow. It won't. The question is whether Americans understand the stage they are in. Because Stage 5 rewards illusion. Stage 6 punishes unpreparedness. History does not remove reserve status as punishment. It removes it when the costs exceed the benefits. and that moment always arrives. Understanding this is not pessimism, it is realism. And realism is the foundation of preparation. When a reserve currency enters its late stage, the most profound changes are not economic. They are psychological. This is the phase where the system still functions, but people begin to feel that something is wrong, even if they cannot articulate what it is. Anxiety rises without a clear cause. Trust weakens without a single scandal. Anger spreads without a single enemy. History shows that this is not coincidence. It is the human response to structural imbalance. In early stages of a reserve currency cycle, effort and reward are closely linked. Work leads to advancement. Savings grow in value. The future feels cumulative. In late stages, that relationship fractures. People work harder but move less. They save more but feel poorer. They follow the rules but feel left behind. This disconnect is not imagined, it is structural. When money creation accelerates faster than real productivity, the system begins to reward proximity to capital rather than contribution to output. Those who own assets benefit. Those who depend on wages fall behind. This dynamic appears in every late-stage reserve currency system. In Britain, it emerged in the late imperial period. In the United States, it intensified after the 1980s and exploded after 2008. The middle class becomes the pressure point, not because it disappears overnight, but because it loses predictability. Housing becomes unattainable relative to income. Education becomes debt-financed rather than opportunity-driven. Healthcare becomes a financial risk rather than a service. None of this feels like collapse. It feels like friction. And friction accumulates psychologically before it manifests politically. The Stoics understood this pattern intuitively. They warned that when external stability erodes, individuals seek certainty elsewhere. If reason cannot provide it, emotion will. This is why late-stage systems experience polarization. Not because people become irrational, but because complexity overwhelms clarity. Simple narratives replace nuanced explanations. Identity replaces analysis. Moral certainty replaces economic literacy. Every side believes it is reacting to injustice. Few understand the structure generating it. Elites behave differently. In early stages, elites invest in production. In late stages, they invest in preservation. Capital seeks safety rather than growth. Influence replaces innovation. Access replaces merit. This is not corruption in the dramatic sense. It is adaptation. When systems feel fragile, those closest to power insulate themselves first. Assets are diversified. Residencies are global. Risk is externalized. This creates a psychological gap between institutions and citizens. People sense that the rules are no longer shared. This perception is deadly to trust. Because trust is not built on outcomes alone, but on symmetry of exposure. When losses are socialized and gains are privatized, legitimacy erodes. This erosion is subtle. Institutions continue to function. Elections continue. Markets continue. But belief weakens. Late-stage societies therefore experience a paradox. They are richer than ever in absolute terms, and more insecure than ever psychologically. The Stoics would not have found this surprising. They argued that insecurity does not arise from scarcity alone, but from unpredictability. When people cannot anticipate outcomes, they become defensive. When effort does not guarantee progress, motivation decays. When narratives shift constantly, identity hardens. This is why nostalgia becomes powerful in late stages. Not because the past was perfect, but because it felt legible. People long not for previous policies, but for previous coherence. They want a world where cause and effect made sense. In this environment, discourse deteriorates. Language becomes weaponized. Complexity is punished. Attention shifts from systems to symbols. This is not a moral failure. It is a cognitive overload response. The human mind is not designed to process systemic abstraction at scale. When it cannot understand structures, it personalizes outcomes. Blame replaces diagnosis. This is why late-stage reserve currency systems experience cultural fragmentation. Shared narratives dissolve. Subcultures harden. Institutions lose interpretive authority. Everyone feels manipulated. Few feel represented. Yet within this psychological turbulence, something important occurs. Adaptation begins at the individual level. Some people double down on denial. Others withdraw into resentment. But a third group adjusts deliberately. They stop expecting systems to provide meaning. They stop outsourcing security. They stop assuming continuity. Instead, they invest inward. Skills, mobility, resilience, optionality. This group does not dominate headlines. But history shows they dominate outcomes. In every late-stage cycle, those who understand the structural reality early suffer less disruption later. They do not panic. They do not overreact. They do not cling to narratives that no longer serve. They accept constraint as information. This is where Stoicism becomes relevant again, not as philosophy, but as psychological technology. The Stoics trained themselves to distinguish between what they controlled and what they did not. They did not waste energy resisting inevitability. They invested energy in preparation. They simplified desires. They reduced dependency. They cultivated competence. In a late-stage monetary system, this mindset becomes invaluable. Because when systems recalibrate, those with flexibility absorb shock better than those with fixed expectations. The final psychological shift of stage 6 is acceptance, not surrender. Acceptance. Acceptance that the system will change. Acceptance that privilege will erode. Acceptance that guarantees were conditional. This acceptance does not weaken individuals. It stabilizes them. Those who accept reality early gain psychological leverage over those who resist it. They are calmer, they plan better, they adapt faster. The late stage of a reserve currency is therefore not only a period of risk, it is a period of sorting between those who demand restoration and those who prepare for transformation, between those who externalize responsibility and those who internalize it, between those who consume narratives and those who read structures. History is clear on this point. The people who thrive after transition are rarely those who benefited most before it. They are those who understood the cycle while it was still unfolding. There is a point in every long historical cycle where the future stops feeling like an extension of the past. Not because life suddenly collapses, not because systems instantly fail, but because assumptions quietly expire. What once felt automatic now feels conditional. What once felt guaranteed now feels negotiable. What once felt stable now requires explanation. This is where the United States finds itself today, not at the end of its story, but at the end of a particular chapter. The chapter defined by a faultless monetary dominance, by the privilege of externalizing costs, by the ability to delay consequences without immediate penalty. History does not remove such privileges suddenly. It dissolves them slowly until behavior finally adjusts. The late stage of a reserve currency cycle is therefore not primarily about economics. It is about adaptation. The question is no longer whether the dollar will remain dominant forever. It won't. No reserve currency ever has. The real question is how a society responds when dominance becomes conditional rather than absolute. Some responses are predictable: denial, anger, blame, nostalgia. These responses are emotionally understandable and strategically useless. They consume energy without producing leverage. History shows that societies do not fail because they experience decline. They fail because they refuse to adapt to it. Adaptation does not mean surrender. It does not mean pessimism. It does not mean retreat from ambition. It means recalibration. In every successful transition away from reserve currency dominance, certain patterns emerge. Consumption slows. Production regains value. Discipline replaces expansion. Competence replaces leverage. This transition is uncomfortable. It requires confronting limits. It requires accepting trade-offs. It requires abandoning illusions. But it is not catastrophic. Portugal survived. The Netherlands survived. Britain survived. What changed was not existence, but position. Living standards adjusted. Global influence narrowed. Domestic priorities shifted. And eventually, new equilibrium emerged. The United States is capable of the same outcome, but capability does not guarantee execution. Execution requires clarity. At the national level, clarity means understanding that monetary power cannot substitute for productive strength indefinitely. At the institutional level, it means recognizing that stability cannot be printed. At the individual level, it means accepting that guarantees were always conditional and acting accordingly. This is where responsibility returns to the individual. Not because individuals caused the cycle, but because individuals experience its consequences. Late-stage systems reward those who reduce dependency. Dependency on debt, dependency on narratives, dependency on institutional protection. This does not mean isolation. It means optionality. Optionality of skills, optionality of income, optionality of geography, optionality of thought. Those with optionality absorb shocks. Those without it absorb losses. This has been true in every transition. The Stoics understood this long before modern economics. They taught that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the capacity to function within it. They did not seek certainty. They sought resilience. Resilience of mind. Resilience of character. Resilience of judgment. These qualities cannot be inflated away. They cannot be outsourced. They cannot be confiscated. In a world of monetary transition, they become the most valuable assets of all. The future of the United States will not be determined by whether the dollar remains dominant. It will be determined by whether Americans can adjust expectations without losing cohesion, whether they can accept limits without abandoning ambition, whether they can reduce excess without embracing scarcity, whether they can disagree without fragmenting. History offers no guarantees, but it offers guidance. And the guidance is consistent. Periods of transition reward seriousness. They punish denial. They elevate competence. They expose fragility. Those who cling to the past suffer most. Those who prepare for the future suffer least. This preparation does not require fear. It requires honesty. Honesty about trade-offs. Honesty about incentives. Honesty about the cycle. The dollar's story is not ending. It is changing. And change, when understood early, is navigable. If you have followed this reflection to its conclusion, it suggests something important. You're not looking for reassurance. You're looking for understanding. That matters. Because understanding precedes agency. If this analysis sharpened your perspective rather than soothed it, that is intentional. Clarity is not comfort. It is orientation, and orientation is what allows people to move through uncertainty without panic. If you believe this conversation deserves continuation, not as noise, but as serious inquiry, staying connected helps ensure that depth is not drowned out by spectacle. A measured acknowledgement helps this reach others who value analysis over slogans. And if you choose to share this, do it deliberately, not broadly, but personally. Send it to one person you trust. One person who would actually want to discuss it. One person who values understanding over outrage. And if you leave a comment, make it meaningful. Not agreement, not applause, but reflection. Because thoughtful dialogue is how serious ideas survive in noisy times. This work exists for one reason: not to predict disaster, not to provoke fear, not to assign blame, but to help people remain grounded while systems recalibrate. History will continue. The cycle will unfold. The only remaining question is who will meet it consciously, and who will be caught arguing with reality as it passes them by.